Ryan McBeth is a U.S. Army veteran and OSINT Analyst. Welcome to our program, Ryan.
Thank you so much. It's always great to be invited on.
Vladimir Putin has fired intercontinental ballistic missile at Ukraine for the first time. Also, he threatened to attack NATO with such missile. He said that it is impossible to intercept such hypersonic missile. Don't you think that this is a threat to the next U.S. administration, to Donald Trump? Putin tries to threaten Trump and tries to convince the West that the West cannot wage global conflict against Russia. What is your take on that?
So if this would have been a threat, it would have been a threat to President Obama. This particular weapon system was developed back in 2008. It's really nothing new. I think it was called the, hopefully I pronounced this correctly. I think it was the RS-26 Rostov, I think. So this weapon system is really nothing new. And technically it's an intermediate range missile, which might actually break the intermediate range treaty that the United States has with Russia. Also, another thing to consider is that this particular weapon system didn't have any explosives on the warheads. The warheads were inert. Now, if something's going Mach 10, you don't necessarily need an explosive. That thing is going to provide a heck of a lot of kinetic energy when it hits the ground. But for something like a weapon system like that, you would need to develop explosives and fusing that actually start to detonate far before the warhead is close to its actual target. And that's because when you're going that fast, even explosions take time, right? So Russia would have to develop a whole new program in order to develop the convention explosives to put on this missile. So essentially, Russia spent about $10 million to say, boo, we scare you. And I think most of America isn't buying it, although I would certainly not want to be one of the citizens in Ukraine that have to rely on America not being scared for protection, because sometimes we spook a little bit easier than the average tough Ukrainian.
Why is Vladimir Putin so confident that the West cannot intercept such missile?
It's propaganda. Look, if you are in front of a missile that's incoming and you launch a missile, you'll be able to intercept it. It's not necessarily a question of speed. He's basically relying on the ignorance of the average person. If you are the target, you should be able to intercept basically any kind of missile coming in, no matter what the speed. Now, if you're to the oblique, meaning to the side, think of it like playing the Olympic game of skeet. If you are at station 5, which is directly perpendicular to those pigeons, those clay pigeons coming out of the skeet houses, it's a lot harder to intercept that missile because you're firing from the oblique and you're trying to catch up to that missile. So there is some truth to that if you are not directly the target of the attack, but he's basically relying on the ignorance of the average person, just doesn't understand how missile systems and interceptions work.
Do you feel that the United States and NATO are ready for a possible conflict against Russia? I mean, to deter and to fight against such hypersonic threats posed by the Russian Federation, Russian army, because Vladimir Putin tries to create such a picture, such a situation in which he can overwhelm Western military capabilities.
Well, it's certainly possible that the first couple of days won't be that great, but you have to understand that Russia has a very limited amount of these weapon systems in general. So if we're talking about overwhelming defenses, first couple of days aren't going to be great. The U.S. will shoot some weapons down. Russia will get some weapons through. That's just kind of the nature of war. But think of NATO as an unstoppable snail. If once NATO's attacked, they're going to begin this relentless march, and then it becomes a question of logistics. It's just essentially how fast can NATO get supplies to the front lines. And once that starts to happen, any adversary, no matter who it is is finished. It's just NATO is this incredibly long-tailed, unstoppable snail. It's extremely slow, but once it gets going, you cannot stop this thing.
Does this missile give Vladimir Putin any kind of serious military advantage over NATO?
Not particularly. It's just another intermediate range ballistic missile. The United States has stealth bombers and fifth generation fighters that actually work, like the F-35. We don't know how many of these intermediate range, really R-36s or R-26s that are possessed by Russia. But in a sense like that, think about it like this: every time you shoot one of these things, you're lighting $10 million on fire, right? And Russia has a limited amount of money and a limited amount of resources, things like machine tools. So they could either create more of these missiles, or they could put those machine tools to work toward doing things like creating the ball bearings they need to put inside their bogies. From what I understand, their train system is breaking down because the actual bogies, which are the wheels that run under the train trucks, those haven't been serviced by Western contractors in quite a while. So if you're Russia, you have this impossible choice. Do you make bogies to allow your rail units to actually function? Do you make missiles? Do you build parts for your oil field? So when you think about it, like, this isn't a super weapon. This is a distraction in the big scheme of things.
Also, this missile strike by Russia was a response to Ukraine's strikes inside Russia with Western-made missiles. Ukraine is really successful in that, because a recent strike on the Kursk region has eliminated dozens of Russian and even North Korean officers. This has been confirmed by Financial Times sources. Also, another strike was conducted by the Ukrainian army this weekend, and several Russian officers have been eliminated by a missile strike on Russian command center in the Kursk region. Don't you think that these strikes inside Russia are too painful for Vladimir Putin, and that's why he tries to threaten Ukraine and the West with his hypersonic intercontinental missiles?
So it's not necessarily painful, although it is painful. I think that essentially what Russia doesn't want is Ukraine being in the political position of being able to receive even more lethal Western aid that could attack inside Russia. As remember that for the longest time, Russia was almost like it's playing American baseball. I'm on first base. You can't attack me because I'm touching this base. And they were able to run circles around Ukraine in some senses because Ukraine couldn't touch them there. So the only thing that Russia can really do is convince the West that Vladimir Putin's going to blow up the world if we keep giving Ukraine weapon systems that can attack inside Russia. And if anything that the Kursk incursion proved was that Russia is fairly toothless. Now, this might be very easy for a guy sitting in a warm apartment to say, well, there's people in Ukraine who only have electricity for 2 hours a day and no heat. But for the most part, Russia is not able to respond militarily. So they have to respond using infodom war, information domain warfare. They have to scare people into thinking that they're strong in order for them to stop these attacks from Ukraine and convince the West not to give Ukraine these long-range weapons that can actually hurt Russia.
And can this strategy work with Donald Trump's administration, from your perspective? Because we have seen new nominations by Trump and his national security team. Also, Kate Kellogg, former U.S. Army Lieutenant General, who would serve as a special assistant to Trump and special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. What is your take on that? And do you feel that these threats can work with Trump's team?
President Trump is always a wild card. You never quite know what he's going to do, which is actually probably better than the situation we have now, because we have a fairly feckless administration that's kind of slow walking aid. President Biden killed a lot of Ukrainians. He did. When he did not give them the aid they needed in the amount they needed. And that's going to be part of his legacy forever. Now, what President Trump does is really going to be kind of up to President Trump. And there are a couple of possibilities here. But the one thing that you need to understand is that President Trump is scared of China. That's his main concern. And I think he knows that if Ukraine falls, if the West doesn't support Ukraine, China is watching. And China is going to take that as a hint that they can just walk right into Taiwan. And that is a very tough thing to look a Ukrainian in the eye and say, we're only supporting you because of Taiwan. But in some senses, that is the real politic. That is the truth behind support. It's not just, yes, Ukraine is a democracy and they must be supported, but ultimately, Taiwan makes computer chips that power the world. If China invades Taiwan, it's going to destroy America's economy. And so I think President Trump knows this, so President Putin can try to scare him as much as he wants, but at the end, the real enemy is China, and that is President Trump's focus.
President Zelensky said that he would be ready for a ceasefire if Ukraine joins NATO and if Ukrainian-controlled territory are being protected by the Article 5 of NATO treaty. On the other hand, we have lots of initiatives for Trump's team. For example, Kate Kellogg proposed, and according to CNN, Trump will move forward and will push a ceasefire in Ukraine. And Kate Kellogg also proposed to provide Ukraine with security assistance in case of a ceasefire. What is your personal opinion on such possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine, for example, next year? And what are the main challenges for reaching a just and long-standing ceasefire, not like 1 or 2 months a ceasefire, just giving Russia enough time to regroup and attack Ukraine again?
I actually don't see a ceasefire is that likely, and I say that because Russia literally can't win the war. And when I say can't win the war, I'm using kind of an American analogy here, but I say can't, not as in they are unable, but literally if Russia wins the war, their economy goes to hell. I believe the inflation rate in Russia is 21%. I believe prices are up 30% since 2002. Literally every single person in Russia is either serving in the army or working at a munitions factory. Everyone. So their unemployment is extremely low, like 2.2%. If Russia wins the war and there's a ceasefire tomorrow, the wheels come off their economy. So it's almost like President Putin needs to keep this war going because they are so far into things that they have to figure out a way to slowly cool off their economy. Because if they stop the war like that and everybody gets fired from their jobs at munitions factories and soldiers get demobilized, what happens next? President Putin gets a Ceausescu special. Because you have millions of young men who know how to use firearms and know military tactics who don't have a job. I saw this movie in Iraq when Iraq had 70% employment. It didn't work out for the ruling government there, and it's not going to work out for Russia. So I actually don't see a ceasefire, mainly because Russia's economy depends on keeping the war going right now.
So if Kremlin, if Putin agrees with a ceasefire deal in Ukraine, he will be eliminated the day after?
That's certainly a possibility. Just maybe not the day after, but once their economy starts collapsing and you have soldiers coming home who, granted, Russia isn't America with our easy access to firearms, but that's never seemed to stop people with knowledge from getting a gun. It might not be necessarily the day after, but once people start feeling the pain of getting fired from their jobs, along with high inflation, that usually causes revolutions. And that's when you might see a couple of army officers think, you know what, I can probably do this a little bit better.
Also, we have seen some reports from Russian media about Kremlin's new strategy at some regions of Russia. They try to prepare their own people for end of the war in Ukraine. They're trying to say that the war would be ended at some day in the future, but it seems like there are some previous signs that Putin's regime is trying to find a way out of this situation and trying to prepare Russian people for the endgame scenario in Ukraine. What does it mean from your perspective?
That's a really good question. It's going to be extremely difficult to extricate themselves from Ukraine, mainly because Russia never really exported a lot to the West other than natural resources and things like natural gas or oil. So, you know, when the United States, when the war ended, when World War II ended in the United States, there was a recession that lasted about 8 months, where you know, people who were returning home needed to find jobs, and war production ended. And at least at that point, the United States was able to sell goods to the entire world, the countries in Asia, countries in Europe that had been devastated by World War II. So there was never really low unemployment. There was a contraction in the economy, but there was never really low unemployment. A problem in Russia's case is that the world doesn't really buy anything from Russia other than oil. So it's not like Russia can start putting people to work exporting goods again, because nobody actually buys anything other than oil, maybe some raw materials. And you can't really get very far in your economy just relying on China and India as trading partners. You need to be able to sell to the world, and right now the world isn't buying. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult for President Putin to extricate himself from the situation. And like I said, that's when you tend to see governments fall.
And also it would be really dangerous for him physically, yes?
I certainly believe so. Look, there's a term we have in America called musical chairs. It's a game that children play in kindergarten, where you have 6 people and 5 chairs set up, and you play music. And when the music stops, you have to sit and find a chair, and the child that doesn't find a chair is out. And, you know, right now there's probably a lot of Russian generals who are looking for a chair when the music stops.
So there is also big possibility of another Prigozhin-style march in Moscow.
That is certainly a possibility, without a doubt.
From your perspective, do you feel that if Putin really does not want to move forward with the endgame scenario, don't you think that his inner circle could try to convince him to stop?
I don't think so. And I say that because it can be very dangerous to go against what the president believes. We are dealing with a country where we have a gentleman who may be insulated from people who will give him bad news or give him contrary advice. Don't forget, when you're dealing with a pseudo dictatorship like Russia, you tend to surround yourselves with people who tell you what you want to think. And that's when you become the smartest person in the room, right? And you start to believe, hey, you know what? I'm infallible. I'm always right. Everyone always agrees with me. I must be correct. So I don't know if the forces that would disagree with President Putin are even there in the room.
Also, Politico reported about President Zelensky's strategy to deal with Donald Trump. Zelensky says that he would be ready for a ceasefire to demonstrate that Vladimir Putin is a no guy, the guy who says no to a possible peace proposal regarding Ukraine. In such case, don't you think that there is also big possibility of confrontation between Trump and Putin if Putin refuses to sign a ceasefire in Ukraine on his terms? And what could happen during this big confrontation between Trump and Putin? what kind of decision could be made by U.S. administration?
Well, I think what would most likely happen is this following scenario. It's that President Trump, and it won't be him, it'll be envoys, like former General Kellogg. They'll reach out to President Putin. They'll ask about this ceasefire. They'll reach out to Zelensky. They'll say, yes, we'd like this ceasefire, but we'd like to join NATO. President Putin then says no. Now, when that happens, President Trump is going to get so angry because now he's going to feel like, hey, I promised I would end the war in 24 hours and you made me look stupid. And then I believe he is going to give every single weapon system to Ukraine that they asked for. Because how dare you make me look stupid, Vlad? I put my neck out on the line for you, and this is what you do to me. So we do have a president who can be very vengeful and vindictive, especially if someone doesn't take advantage of his kindness. So I could easily see the president, after a couple of weeks, starting to arm Ukraine to the levels that they deserve and to the levels that the Biden administration was afraid to do.
And also there are some discussions on possible sanctions against Russia, against Russian energy sector. What kind of economic measures the United States still has?
Well, there's not a lot of arrows left in our quiver when it comes to sanctions, but I believe there is a bank that is still operating because Russia is still sending energy into Europe. And, one of the things that President Biden failed to do was he failed to reassure Europe that the United States would supply natural gas to Europe during the winter. This was kind of a problem in the domestic area of American politics because there are Americans who don't want us to pump any more oil and who don't want us to deliver natural gas because of climate change. But that really opened the door for Russia to continue getting gas. They're sending oil and natural gas into Europe in some cases. So if the United States, if President Trump allows the United States to start drilling for more oil and sending natural gas over to Europe, there will be less of a reason to rely on Russia. And that final bank that Russia uses can close, which will make it a lot harder for Russia to acquire hard currency.
Let's cover also situation on the Middle East. It seems like Russia is losing its position in Syria because Syrian rebels have captured the city of Aleppo, the second largest city of Syria, and they are on their way to Damascus, the capital city of Syria. It seems also Russian forces have started to bombard Syrian rebels. What is your reaction to this development, and what does Vladimir Putin feel about that? And how could it influence the war in Ukraine? Because more Russian soldiers will be deployed to Syria and will move forward and will die there.
If you want to talk about Syria, my first question is how much time do you have?
Big topic.
Syria is Syria is a big one. That is an absolute mess. There's about 70 different forces that are fighting there. Look, for the most part, Russia has always supported Syria because they were allies during the Cold War. And, one of the things that Russia mainly did during its time in Syria was that it essentially, you hate to use a video game term here, but they were farming XP. Right? They were doing small missions to allow their pilots to gain experience and things like precision bombing, forward air controller. And they fought ISIS, or as they call it in the Arab world, Daesh, using aircraft. So that way the Syrian army could focus on fighting both the Islamist and non-Islamist militias and rebels. So I don't really see Russia sending more troops to Syria. Syria was kind of a sideshow where they were able to get their troops a little bit of experience, and then they just couldn't leave that commitment, basically because there was a level of pride in having a warm water port and an air base in Syria, and look, we're helping our allies. And it's also a place to send your generals to. If you have a general who isn't very good in Ukraine, he performs poorly, but you like the guy, you don't want to fire him, you could always send him over to Syria. And, he can't do a lot of damage there, right? So I don't actually see Russia sending more troops to back up the Assad regime. At this point, they have bigger problems, and those fighters and those troops that are there, which aren't that numerous, I think it's about 2,000, 2,500-ish troops, and that includes maintenance personnel for their weapon systems. So that's roughly 3 days casualties for Russia and Ukraine right now. So the amount of troops there is just a drop in the bucket. It would be easier for Russia just to leave and use that equipment someplace else.
And my last question for you would be about the Kursk region. It seems like Vladimir Putin has established a new deadline to liberate this region because his forces failed to do so previously. How can you assess the situation there, and why do Russians fail to deter, to repel this attack?
Attacking is hard. When this whole war first started, it's almost like the world forgot about the horrors of landmines. And we are at a point right now where if you don't have air superiority, then you're not going to be able to attack across a minefield, because there is just, these minefields chew people up. And it is certainly obvious that our engineering units and engineering capabilities to breach minefields are lacking, especially in the United States providing Western aid to Ukraine. So now Russia is on the attack, and they are getting chewed up in the same kind of minefields that they helped invent back after the Kharkiv offensive in 2022. So attacking is hard. I mean, it's really that simple. Russia is trying to do something that's very difficult, which is breach a wire mined obstacle under heavy fire without good air support. And that is just something that very few armies can do. And when armies do it, they take casualties. And war is hard. That's really what it kind of comes down to. That Russia hasn't really gained any ground in Kursk because war is hard, and now the Ukrainians are on the defensive. And it's easier to be on the defensive.
Thank you, Ryan, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you so much. I always appreciate coming out.